War is, by its very nature, a shocking affair. It is the organized, systematic dismantling of peace, the suspension of moral norms, and the unleashing of humanity's most destructive impulses. Every battle, every skirmish, every casualty is a shock to the system of civilization. Yet, within the vast and bloody tapestry of the Second World War, a conflict that claimed over 70 million lives, there are moments that stand apart. Battles so profoundly brutal, so unexpectedly calamitous, or so strategically seismic that they shocked not only the soldiers who fought them, but the commanders who planned them, and the world that watched in horror.
These are not necessarily the largest battles, though many were. They are not always the most famous, though their names have become legendary. They are, instead, the confrontations that represent a paradigm shift in the understanding of the war. They are the moments where the veneer of strategy and planning was stripped away to reveal the raw, chaotic, and often unthinkable reality of total war. The shock could be tactical, a brilliant maneuver that caught an entire army off guard. It could be strategic, a defeat so catastrophic it altered the course of the entire conflict. Or it could be deeply, chillingly human, a descent into a level of savagery and suffering that defies comprehension.
In this examination, we will journey across the globe, from the frozen steppes of Russia to the tropical jungles of the Pacific, from the rubble-choked cities of Europe to the blood-soaked beaches of Normandy. We will delve into 10 battles that encapsulate the shocking nature of World War II. We will move beyond the simple statistics of men and material and explore the human cost, the psychological impact, and the enduring legacy of these monumental clashes. These are the stories of overconfidence shattered, of impossible odds defied, of human endurance tested to its absolute limit, and of the horrifying depths of depravity that war can unlock. This is a journey into the heart of the storm, a look at the moments that defied the most destructive conflict in human history. These battles were not just turning points on a map, they were crucibles that forged the modern world in fire and blood. They are a testament to the fact that in war, the most certain thing is uncertainty, and the most predictable element is the capacity for profound and lasting shock. Prepare to witness the moments that left the world breathless, the 10 most shocking battles of the Second World War. Our countdown begins not with a clash of European titans, but in the humid, tropical landscape of Southeast Asia, with a battle that would shatter the myth of imperial invincibility and deliver a stunning psychological blow to the Allied cause. It was a place considered a fortress, an impregnable bastion of the British Empire, the Gibraltar of the East. Its fall was not just a military defeat, it was a humiliation that resonated across the globe, signaling a fundamental shift in the balance of power. This was the Battle of Singapore, a campaign of shocking speed, brilliant and unorthodox tactics, and catastrophic Allied miscalculation. In early 1942, the British Empire still projected an aura of dominance. Its vast territory spanned the globe, and its military, while stretched thin by the war in Europe, was believed to be a formidable force. Singapore was the crown jewel of its Far East possessions, a bustling port city protected by massive naval guns, a significant garrison of British, Australian, and Indian troops, and the dense, seemingly impassable jungles of the Malayan Peninsula to the north. The strategic thinking was simple. Any invasion would have to come from the sea, where the Royal Navy and the fortress's formidable coastal defenses would make short work of any attacker. This confidence, however, was built on a foundation of dangerous assumptions. The most critical of these was the belief that the Malayan jungle was a green wall, a natural barrier that no modern army could effectively penetrate. The second was a deeply ingrained sense of racial and military superiority, a dismissive view of the Japanese military as second-rate, lacking in initiative and modern equipment. Both of these assumptions would prove to be disastrously, fatally wrong.
The Japanese had a different plan, one that was audacious, swift, and perfectly tailored to exploit every single one of Britain's weaknesses. Under the command of General Tomoyuki Yamashita, a formidable and aggressive strategist known as the Tiger of Malaya, the Japanese 25th Army had prepared meticulously. They had trained extensively in jungle warfare, developing tactics to move quickly and silently through terrain the British considered impassable. They did not see the jungle as an obstacle, but as a cloak, a means of concealment and surprise. And they possessed a secret weapon, not of advanced technology, but of simple, elegant mobility: the bicycle. On December 8, 1941, just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces landed on the northeast coast of Malaya at Kota Bharu. Simultaneously, another force pushed south from Thailand. The Allied command in Singapore was slow to react, still convinced that the main threat lay at sea. They were utterly unprepared for the speed and ferocity of the Japanese land assault. The bicycle blitzkrieg had begun, and it would be one of the most shocking and successful campaigns of the entire war. Commonwealth troops, trained for conventional European warfare, found themselves completely outmaneuvered. The Japanese soldiers, pedaling furiously down plantation tracks and narrow jungle paths on confiscated bicycles, bypassed heavily defended roads and strongpoints with ease. They moved with a speed that seemed impossible, covering dozens of miles a day, constantly hooking behind the Allied lines, cutting off communication, and sowing chaos and panic. The British and their allies were always one step behind, forced into a series of costly and disorganized retreats. Each defensive line the Allies established, at Jitra, at Kampar, on the Muar River, was intended to be a robust barrier to halt the Japanese advance. But time and again, Yamashita's forces would pin the defenders in place with a frontal assault while other units infiltrated through the dense jungle on their flanks. The defenders would suddenly find themselves attacked from the sides and the rear, their positions untenable, their retreat routes threatened. Morale began to crumble under the relentless pressure and the unnerving sense of being constantly surrounded.
Japanese forces は not just fast, they were also incredible tenacious and brutal. They employed light tanks effectively, which the British had longly assumed would be useless in the jungle terrain. They were supported by a dominant air force operating from captured British airfields, which relentlessly bombed and strafed the retreating columns of Allied soldiers, adding to the confusion and terror. The campaign became a 70-day nightmare of retreat for the Commonwealth forces.
Compounding the military disaster was a catastrophic naval blunder. In an attempt to intercept the Japanese invasion fleet, two of the Royal Navy's most powerful warships, the battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse, were dispatched from Singapore without adequate air cover. On December 10th, in a shocking demonstration of the new reality of naval warfare, Japanese bombers and torpedo planes found the ships and, in less than 2 hours, sent both behemoths to the bottom of the South China Sea. The sinking of Force Z, as it was known, was a devastating blow. It meant that Singapore was now cut off from any significant naval reinforcement, its sea-facing guns rendered strategically irrelevant. The loss of the ship stripped away the last vestiges of Allied naval supremacy in the region and sent a shockwave of despair through the command structure. The psychological impact was immense. If these mighty symbols of British power could be so easily destroyed, what hope was there for the beleaguered soldiers fighting a losing battle in the jungle? The retreat down the Malayan Peninsula accelerated, becoming less of a strategic withdrawal and more of a desperate flight. By the end of January 1942, the battered remnants of the Commonwealth forces had been pushed all the way back to Singapore Island itself. The causeway linking the island to the mainland was blown, a final, futile gesture of defiance. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, the British commander, now found himself responsible for the defense of a city teeming with over 1 million civilians and packed with demoralized, exhausted troops. He had a force of around 85,000 men, a numerically superior army to the 35,000 Japanese soldiers preparing to assault the island. On paper, the defense should have been strong, but Percival's army was a broken instrument. The troops were a mix of British, Australian, and Indian units, many of them poorly trained, ill-equipped, and psychologically shattered by the long retreat. Coordination between the different national contingents was poor, and supplies were already running low, particularly of clean water after Japanese bombing damaged the city's reservoirs. Percival, a cautious and methodical commander, was ill-suited to the fluid, desperate crisis he now faced. He made a critical error in judgment, expecting the main Japanese assault to come from the northeast of the island. He concentrated his strongest units, the Australian 8th Division, in that sector. Yamashita, however, was a master of deception. He launched diversionary feints and bombardments in the northeast while preparing his main thrust for the northwest coast, a sector defended by weary and under-equipped Indian and Australian brigades. He was gambling, bluffing with a force that was outnumbered and low on ammunition itself. On the night of February 8th, under the cover of a ferocious artillery barrage, the first wave of Japanese troops crossed the narrow Johor Strait in collapsible boats. They landed on the northwest coast and quickly overwhelmed the thinly spread defenders. The fighting was fierce and confused, taking place in the darkness amidst mangrove swamps and creeks. Communication lines were cut, and command and control on the Allied side disintegrated almost immediately. Panic began to set in. Units fell back without orders, creating gaps in the line that the Japanese ruthlessly exploited. The invaders pushed inland, seizing key objectives like the Tanaga airfield. Within 2 days, they had established a secure beachhead and were pouring more troops onto the island. The Allied defense, which should have been a fortress wall, was crumbling from the inside out. The city of Singapore was now directly in the line of fire. Yamashita pressed his advantage relentlessly, pushing his forces towards the city's reservoirs in the center of the island. He knew that controlling the water supply was the key to breaking the will of the defenders and the civilian population. The fighting devolved into a brutal, close-quarter struggle in the suburbs and outskirts of Singapore. The Japanese were merciless, and atrocities began to mount, most infamously at the Alexandra Barracks Hospital, where wounded soldiers, doctors, and nurses were bayoneted and shot by Japanese troops. The situation for General Percival was becoming hopeless. The city was under constant air and artillery bombardment. Fires raged out of control. The water supply was on the verge of collapse, threatening a catastrophic epidemic. The streets were filled with dead and dying civilians. His military formations were a disorganized mess, and he was receiving reports that his men were no longer capable of mounting a coordinated counterattack. On the morning of February 15, 1942, just 1 week after the invasion of the island began, General Percival made the agonizing decision to surrender. He had been comprehensively outthought, outfought, and outmaneuvered by a smaller, more determined enemy. The image of Percival, carrying a Union Jack and a white flag, marching to the Ford Motor Factory to formally surrender to General Yamashita, became an enduring symbol of imperial collapse. Winston Churchill would later call it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. The numbers were staggering. Around 80,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops became prisoners of war, joining the 50,000 who had been captured during the Malayan campaign. Their fate would be one of unimaginable horror in the brutal Japanese POW camps and on projects like the infamous Thai-Burma Railway. The shock of Singapore's fall was not just in the scale of the defeat, but in what it represented. It shattered the illusion of Western military superiority in Asia. It demonstrated that a well-trained, highly motivated Asian army could defeat a European one. For the people of Asia living under colonial rule, it was a powerful, transformative moment. For the British Empire, it was the beginning of the end. The fortress had fallen, and with it, an entire era of unquestioned dominance.
The speed, the totality, and the humiliation of the defeat made it one of the most profound shocks of the war. From the humid jungles of the Far East, we now travel to the opposite extreme, the vast frozen expanse of the Russian winter. Here, on the very doorstep of the Soviet capital, the world would witness another monumental shock. This was not a shock of collapse, but of unexpected, almost unbelievable resilience. It was the moment the seemingly invincible German war machine, the Wehrmacht, was fought to a bloody standstill and then hurled back in its first major strategic defeat of the war. This was the Battle of Moscow, a desperate, brutal struggle that would prove the war on the Eastern Front was far from over. In the autumn of 1941, Adolf Hitler's Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, seemed to be an unstoppable triumph. German panzer divisions had sliced deep into Soviet territory, encircling and destroying entire Red Army formations in a series of massive battles. Millions of Soviet soldiers were killed or captured. Cities like Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev had fallen. To the German High Command, and indeed to many observers in the West, the collapse of the Soviet Union seemed not just likely, but imminent. By October, the final prize was in sight: Moscow. Hitler, diverting forces from other objectives against the advice of some of his generals, launched Operation Typhoon, the all-out assault on the capital. He confidently declared to the German people that the enemy was already broken and will never rise again. The initial phase of the operation was another stunning success. German forces broke through the Soviet defensive lines, creating two more enormous pockets around Vyazma and Bryansk, capturing another 650,000 Red Army soldiers. The road to Moscow appeared wide open. The German vanguard, in some cases, advanced so rapidly that they could reportedly see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. Panic began to grip the Soviet capital. The government, foreign embassies, and crucial factory equipment were evacuated eastward to cities like Kuyabyshev. The city was placed under martial law. There were riots, looting, and a sense of impending doom as rumors spread that Stalin himself had fled. But Stalin had not fled. In a pivotal moment of defiance, he chose to remain in Moscow. His decision was a crucial signal to the people and the army that the capital would not be abandoned. On November 7th, the traditional anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, Stalin delivered one of the most important speeches of his career. In a shocking display of resolve, he ordered the annual military parade to be held in Red Square, despite the looming threat of German bombers. Snow fell on the assembled troops as they marched past Lenin's mausoleum, their bayonets fixed, their faces grim. From the parade ground, these soldiers marched directly to the front lines, just a few miles away. The symbolism was immense. This was a fight to the death. The defense of the city became a national crusade. Hundreds of thousands of civilians, mostly women and teenagers, were mobilized to dig vast networks of anti-tank ditches and fortifications around the city's perimeter. They worked in freezing conditions, often with little more than shovels, their bare hands clawing at the frozen earth. Inexperienced and poorly equipped People's Militia units, composed of factory workers and citizens who were not yet conscripted, were thrown into the fighting. They suffered horrific casualties, often armed with little more than rifles and a handful of grenades, but they bought precious time. The Soviet defense was desperate, but it was also cunning and utterly ruthless. General Georgy Zhukov, a tough and brilliant commander whom Stalin had recalled from Leningrad to take charge of Moscow's defense, orchestrated a strategy of attrition. He demanded his soldiers hold their ground at all costs. Orders were issued that any soldier retreating without permission would be shot. The Red Army was trading space for time and bodies for time, bleeding the German advance for every yard of frozen soil. And then the weather turned. The autumn rains, known as the Rasputitsa, began, turning the unpaved Russian roads into impassable rivers of mud. The German blitzkrieg, so dependent on the mobility of its tanks and trucks, literally bogged down.
Vehicles were stuck up to their axles, supply lines stretched to the breaking point, and the pace of the advance slowed to a crawl. The German soldiers, still in their summer uniforms, were exposed to the relentless cold and wet.
The mud was a shock, but what came next was a catastrophe for the invaders. In mid-November, the temperature plummeted. The infamous Russian winter arrived with a vengeance, earlier and more severe than usual. Temperatures dropped to -20, -30, even -40 degrees Celsius. For the German army, it was a disaster they were completely unprepared for. They lacked winter clothing, proper lubricants for their vehicles and weapons, and antifreeze. Engines refused to start, gun breeches froze solid. Frostbite became a more dangerous enemy than the Red Army, with tens of thousands of German soldiers suffering horrific injuries from the cold.
In contrast, the Soviets were in their element. They were accustomed to the brutal cold and were well equipped for it. More importantly, Zhukov had been husbanding a secret weapon. While the Germans were bleeding themselves dry in the frontal assaults on Moscow, Stalin had been transferring fresh, well-equipped, and winter-trained divisions from the Far East. These Siberian troops, confident that Japan would not attack the Soviet Union after being checked in a border clash at Khalkhin Gol, were a strategic reserve of immense power. They were poised, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. By early December, the German offensive had ground to a halt. The soldiers at the front were exhausted, frozen, and at the absolute limit of their endurance. The final push on Moscow had failed. It was at this moment of maximum German weakness that Zhukov unleashed his counterstroke. On December 5, 1941, the Siberian divisions, supported by T-34 tanks which performed far better in the cold than their German counterparts, smashed into the thinly stretched and overextended German lines north and south of Moscow. The shock to the German forces was total. They had believed the Red Army to be on the verge of annihilation. They had no intelligence on the existence of this massive strategic reserve. Suddenly, they were not the attackers, but the attacked. The fresh, white camouflaged Soviet troops skiing through the deep snow seemed to be everywhere. The German front, brittle from exhaustion and the cold, began to crack and then shatter. What followed was the Wehrmacht's first large-scale retreat of the war. It was a chaotic and desperate affair. Hitler, furious and refusing to believe the reality of the situation, issued a stand-fast order, forbidding any withdrawal. He sacked numerous high-ranking generals, including the commander of Army Group Center, Fedor von Bock, and took personal command of the army. This order, while preventing a complete and total collapse of the front, condemned tens of thousands of German soldiers to death as they tried to hold untenable positions in the horrific cold. The Soviet counteroffensive pushed the Germans back, in some places over 150 miles. It was not a war-winning blow, and the Wehrmacht would eventually stabilize its lines, but the damage was done. The myth of German invincibility was shattered. Operation Barbarossa had failed in its primary objective of defeating the Soviet Union in a single campaign. The war on the Eastern Front would not be a short, victorious blitzkrieg, but a long, grinding war of attrition. A war that Germany, with its limited resources and manpower, was ill-equipped to win. The shock of the Battle of Moscow was threefold. First, there was the shock of the Soviet Union's survival. Against all odds and expectations, it had not collapsed. Second, there was the shock of the Wehrmacht's defeat. The finest army in the world had been stopped and thrown back. Finally, there was the shock of the sheer inhuman brutality of the conditions, a terrifying preview of the horrors that would define the rest of the war on the Eastern Front. The gates of Moscow had held, and in doing so, they had changed the course of world history. If the Battle of Moscow was a shock of grand strategic scale, our next battle is a shock of a different kind. It is a story of tactical horror, of a grinding, attritional nightmare fought in a place that offered no strategic value, only suffering and death. This was a battle that the American soldiers who fought it would remember not with pride, but with a shudder of revulsion. It was a place where entire divisions were chewed up and spat out for a few meaningless yards of dark, foreboding woodland. This was the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest, a conflict so costly and brutal that it became known to the GIs as the meat grinder. In the autumn of 1944, the Allied armies were driving across France and Belgium, pushing the Germans back towards their own border. After the stunning success of the Normandy landings and the breakout that followed, a mood of supreme confidence, even overconfidence, permeated the Allied high command. There was a prevailing belief that the German army was a spent force, on the verge of total collapse, and that the war could be over by Christmas. It was this optimism that led American commanders to make a fateful and tragic decision: to punch directly through the Hurtgen Forest. The Hurtgen Forest was a 50-square-mile area of dense, rugged woodland straddling the German-Belgian border. It was part of the northern shoulder of the Ardennes, a region of steep hills, deep ravines, and towering fir trees that grew so close together they blocked out the sky, creating a perpetual twilight on the forest floor. It was crisscrossed by few roads and was a natural defensive fortress. The forest itself was merely a gateway to the ultimate objective, the Roer River dams, which the Allies feared the Germans could blow to flood the plains to the north and stall a major offensive. American commanders, including General Omar Bradley and General Courtney Hodges of the U.S. First Army, saw the forest as a problem to be solved directly. They believed a powerful, head-on assault could clear the area quickly and secure the flank for the larger push into Germany. They drastically underestimated the terrain and the enemy. The Germans, under the command of the wily and experienced Field Marshal Walter Model, understood the forest perfectly. They knew it was the great equalizer, a place where American superiority in air power, armor, and artillery would be almost completely negated. The Germans had prepared meticulously. They had seeded the forest with thousands of mines and booby traps. They had built well-concealed concrete pillboxes, bunkers, and machine gun nests as part of their formidable Siegfried Line defenses. They had pre-sighted their mortars and artillery on every road, trail, and clearing. They did not need to hold a continuous line. They needed only to hold the key terrain and use the forest itself as their primary weapon. The battle began in September 1944 and would drag on for nearly 5 agonizing months. From the very beginning, it was a waking nightmare for the American GIs. The moment they entered the forest, they were swallowed by the gloom. Visibility was often reduced to just a few yards. The dense canopy of trees made air support impossible and artillery fire wildly inaccurate. The shells that were fired often struck the treetops, creating deadly tree bursts that rained down a lethal shower of wood splinters and shrapnel on the soldiers below, friend and foe alike. Tanks, the spearhead of the American army, were all but useless. They were confined to the narrow, muddy fire breaks and trails, where they were easily ambushed by German anti-tank teams armed with Panzerfausts. They became little more than mobile pillboxes, easily isolated and destroyed. The battle, therefore, became an infantryman's fight, a primitive, close-quarter struggle of unimaginable horror. Progress was measured not in miles, but in feet. A platoon would be ordered to take a small hill or a specific pillbox. They would advance slowly, cautiously, through the dense undergrowth, every snap of a twig signaling their position to a hidden enemy. Suddenly, the forest would erupt with the sound of machine gun fire, the chugging of German MG-42s, and the crump of mortar shells. Men would be cut down before they even saw the enemy. The fighting was intimate and terrifying. It was a war of small units, squads and platoons, fighting isolated, desperate battles, often cut off from communication with their headquarters. Casualties were catastrophic. A company that went into the line with 180 men could be reduced to 30 or 40 effectives in a single day of fighting.
Replacements, fresh-faced and inexperienced, were fed into the meat grinder, often lasting only a few hours before being killed or wounded.
The weather added another layer of misery. As autumn turned to winter, constant rain and snow turned the forest floor into a frozen, muddy swamp. Soldiers lived in waterlogged foxholes, constantly cold and wet. Trench foot became rampant, incapacitating thousands. The simple act of staying warm and dry was a battle in itself. The perpetual gloom and the constant, nerve-shredding tension took a devastating psychological toll.
This was the battle where the term combat fatigue, what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder, became a crisis for the U.S. Army. Men simply broke down under the unrelenting strain. The constant proximity to death, the sight of their friends being torn apart, the feeling of being trapped in a hopeless, never-ending battle pushed them past the breaking point. The number of non-battle casualties, those suffering from exhaustion, exposure, and psychological collapse, was staggering, at times equaling the number of those killed and wounded by the enemy. One of the most infamous episodes of the battle was the fight for the Kaw River Gorge and the town of Schmidt. The U.S. 28th Infantry Division, nicknamed the Keystone Division, was ordered to take the town. After a brutal fight, they succeeded, but they found themselves in an exposed, untenable position with their supply lines cut by German counterattacks. For days, the defenders of Schmidt were pounded by artillery and assaulted from all sides. The division was decimated, suffering over 6,000 casualties in a matter of days. The survivors who straggled back were hollow-eyed, traumatized shells of their former selves. The 28th Infantry Division was effectively destroyed as a fighting unit. The shocking part of the Herdgen Forest was not just the brutal conditions, but the strategic futility of it all. The battle became a matter of pride and momentum for the American command. They continued to pour divisions into the forest, the 9th, the 4th, the 8th, the 83rd, each one being bled white for marginal gains. They were fighting the battle the Germans wanted them to fight, a grinding war of attrition in terrain that favored the defender. The original objective, the Ruhr dams, remained in German hands until February 1945, long after the main fighting in the forest had ceased. In the end, the Battle of the Herdgen Forest cost the U.S. Army over 33,000 casualties, including killed, wounded, and non-battle injuries. German losses were also heavy, but they had achieved their objective. They had stalled the American advance and inflicted disproportionate losses on a superior force. The battle has been heavily criticized by military historians as a costly and unnecessary mistake, a bloody testament to the dangers of overconfidence and a failure to appreciate the challenges of terrain. For the men who fought there, the name Herdgen became a synonym for hell. It was a battle without glory, without clear victories, only a daily struggle for survival in a dark, cursed forest that seemed to consume men's bodies and souls. It stands as a shocking reminder that even in a war of rapid movement and grand strategy, the fate of soldiers can be decided in a few square miles of mud, trees, and unrelenting horror. It was a battle that served no real purpose, except to bleed two armies in one of the most unforgiving landscapes in Europe. From the claustrophobic horror of the forest, we move to the vast open plains of the Eastern Front, the setting for a battle of truly epic proportions. This was not a fight for a patch of woods or a single city. It was a titanic collision of entire armies, a clash of steel on a scale never before seen in human history. The shock of this battle was its sheer, mind-boggling size and the ferocity of the armored warfare that defined it. This was the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history and the decisive turning point of the war in the East. By the summer of 1943, the tide of the war had turned against Germany. The disaster at Stalingrad had bled the Wehrmacht of his finest army and shattered its aura of invincibility. Yet, the German army was still a formidable fighting force, capable of launching powerful offensives.
After a successful counterattack that recaptured the city of Kharkov in the spring, a large bulge or salient had been created in the front line, centered around the city of Kursk. This salient, jutting 70 miles into the German lines, was an obvious target.
Für das High Command der Kursk-Salient repräsentierte eine finale Opportunität zu regulieren die strategische Initiative auf der Eastern Front. Der Plan, codenamed Operation Citadel, war ein klassischer Pincer-Movement. Zwei powervolle germanische Armeegruppen, eins vom Nord und eins vom South, würden die Flanken des Salients attackieren, aiming zu mieten in der Mitte, encirkeln und destruyen die massive Sowjetforcen within. Eine dezidierte Victoria at Kursk, Hitler betonte, würde krippeln die Red Army, restaurieren germanische Prestige und vielleicht ebenfalls force die Sowjetunion zu suchen einen genegozierten Peace.
To achieve this victory, Germany mustered the very best of its military might. They assembled nearly 900,000 men, thousands of aircraft, and, most importantly, a massive concentration of armor. This included their newest and most technologically advanced tanks, the Panther with its powerful long-barreled 75mm gun, and the heavily armored Tiger with its feared 88mm gun. They also deployed huge Ferdinand tank destroyers. The Germans were counting on this technological superiority to smash through the Soviet defenses and achieve a swift, decisive victory. But this time, there would be no surprise. The Soviets, through a combination of excellent intelligence from sources like the Lucy spy ring and their own frontline reconnaissance, knew exactly what the Germans were planning. They knew where the attacks would come, when they would come, and what forces they would involve. This foreknowledge allowed Joseph Stalin and his top generals, including Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, to make a fateful strategic decision. Instead of launching a preemptive attack of their own, they would do the opposite. They would prepare a defense of unprecedented depth and strength, let the Germans attack them, absorb the blow, and then, once the enemy was exhausted and bled white, they would launch their own massive counteroffensive. The preparations for this defense were on a scale that defies imagination. For months, the Red Army and hundreds of thousands of civilians worked around the clock to turn the Kursk salient into the most heavily fortified piece of ground on the planet. They laid over 500,000 anti-tank mines, creating dense minefields that were miles deep. They dug thousands of miles of trenches. They constructed a series of 8 distinct defensive belts, one behind the other, stretching back over 100 miles. Each belt was a complex web of anti-tank ditches, barbed wire, machine gun nests, and fortified positions for anti-tank guns.
The Soviets massed an enormous force to man these defenses, over 1.3 million soldiers, 20,000 artillery pieces, and, crucially, more than 3,300 tanks. While the German Panther and Tiger tanks were individually superior to the Soviet T-34, the Soviets had them in far greater numbers. They planned to use their T-34s to swarm the heavier German panzers, closing the distance quickly to negate the German advantage in range and firepower. The stage was set for a monumental battle of attrition, a clash of quantity versus quality.
After several delays, as Hitler waited for more of the new Panther tanks to arrive at the front, Operation Citadel was finally launched on July 5, 1943. The German assault began with a massive artillery and air bombardment. Then, the panzer divisions began to roll forward, spearheading the attack. On the northern flank, the German Ninth Army under Walter Model slammed into the Soviet lines. They immediately ran into the incredibly dense minefields and the ferocious layered defense. Progress was agonizingly slow, and casualties in men and tanks mounted rapidly. The German advance was measured in yards, not miles, and they were never able to achieve a decisive breakthrough.
Their main effort, however, was in the south, where the 4th Panzer Army, led by Hermann Hoth und equipped mit der Elite 2. SS Panzerkorps, made more significant progress. Dies waren seinerseits eine der besten Trupps in der deutschen Armee und fochten mit Skill und Determination, slowly but surely punching their way through the first und zweite sowjetische defensive belts. But the cost war horrendous. Für every yard they gained, they paid a heavy price in blood and steel. Die Sowjets fochten mit suizidaler Bravour, defending every trench und village to the last man. Anti-tank gun crews would continue to fire until their position was overrun and they were killed.
The climax of the battle, and the event for which it is most famous, occurred on July 12th near a small village called Prokhorovka. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps, having pushed deep into the Soviet defenses, was preparing to continue its advance when it was met by a massive counterattack from the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army. What followed was a chaotic, brutal, and gargantuan clash of armor, the legendary tank battle of Prokhorovka. Nearly 1,200 tanks and assault guns from both sides converged on a small, rolling piece of farmland. The fighting was a swirling, confused melee fought at point-blank range. The air was thick with smoke, dust, and the shriek of metal. Tanks rammed each other, fired into each other's flanks, and exploded in massive fireballs. The superior range of the German guns was negated in the close-quarters chaos. Soviet T-34s, using their speed and numbers, swarmed the heavier but less nimble Tigers and Panthers, aiming for their thinner side and rear armor. The battlefield became a graveyard of burning steel. By the end of the day, hundreds of tanks from both sides were smoldering wrecks. While the exact numbers are still debated by historians, both sides suffered terrible losses. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps was battered and exhausted, its offensive power spent. The Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army was also severely mauled, but it had achieved its strategic objective. It had stopped the German spearhead dead in its tracks. The Battle of Prokhorovka was the high watermark of the German offensive. The very next day, on July 13th, Hitler called off Operation Citadel. The Allied invasion of Sicily had just begun, and he needed to divert forces, including the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, to Italy. But the reality was that the offensive at Kursk had already failed. The German army had thrown its best divisions and its newest equipment against the Soviet defenses and had broken itself upon them. Now it was the Red Army's turn. Just as they had planned, with the German offensive forces exhausted, they launched their own massive counteroffensives north and south of the salient. Operation Kutuzov and Operation Rumyantsev smashed into the weakened German lines. The tired German divisions, having suffered immense losses, were unable to stop the Soviet juggernaut. The Red Army recaptured the cities of Orel and Belgorod, and on August 23rd, they liberated Kharkov for the final time. The Battle of Kursk was officially over. The losses were staggering. The Germans suffered around 200,000 casualties and lost hundreds of tanks and aircraft. But the Soviet losses were even more horrific, with some estimates putting their casualties as high as 800,000 men and thousands of tanks. Yet, the Soviet Union, with its vast reserves of manpower, could absorb such losses. Germany could not. The shock of Kursk was the final, definitive proof that Germany could not win the war on the Eastern Front. They had lost the strategic initiative forever. From this point forward, the Wehrmacht would be on the defensive, fighting a long, bloody, and ultimately hopeless retreat all the way back to Berlin. The largest tank battle in history had been a gamble for victory and a bid to turn the tide. It ended in a catastrophic defeat that sealed the fate of the Third Reich in the East. Our next battle takes us to the Western Front, to a day that lives in history as a triumph of Allied planning, courage, and industrial might. It was the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, the long-awaited liberation of Europe. Yet for the men in the first waves of the assault, this day of victory was a shocking descent into one of the most brutal and concentrated slaughters of the war. This was D-Day, the Normandy landings, and specifically the horrific struggle for a stretch of sand codenamed Omaha Beach.
By June 6, 1944, the Allies had assembled the largest amphibious invasion force in history. Operation Overlord was a masterpiece of logistics, deception, and planning. Under the supreme command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, nearly 160,000 soldiers were set to land on 5 beaches along a 50-mile stretch of the Normandy coast in France. They were supported by a massive armada of over 5,000 ships and an air force of more than 11,000 aircraft. The scale of the operation was, in itself, a shock. The landings on 4 of the 5 beaches, Utah and the British and Canadian beaches of Gold, Juno, and Sword, were difficult but largely successful. Casualties were lighter than anticipated, and the troops were able to secure their beachheads and began pushing inland. But on one beach, the plan went catastrophically wrong. On Omaha Beach, the American soldiers of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions were thrown into a charnel house, a perfectly designed killing field that would earn it the grim nickname Bloody Omaha. Omaha Beach was a 4-mile crescent of sand, overlooked by steep bluffs and cliffs rising up to 100 feet. It was a formidable natural defensive position, and the Germans, under the command of the experienced Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, had fortified it expertly. The beach was littered with the Devil's Garden of obstacles, hedgehogs, Belgian gates, and mine stakes, all designed to wreck landing craft and funnel the attackers into pre-planned kill zones. The bluffs were honeycombed with a network of concrete bunkers, pillboxes, trenches, and machine gun nests, all connected and mutually supporting. And in a fatal failure of Allied intelligence, the beach was defended not by the expected low-quality static division, but by the battle-hardened and well-trained German 352nd Infantry Division. The assault began in the early morning hours under a gray, foreboding sky. The sea was rough, with waves much higher than predicted. This had an immediate and devastating effect. Many of the landing craft were swamped by the waves, sinking before they even reached the shore, and drowning soldiers weighed down by their heavy equipment. Those who did make it to the beach were often violently seasick, weak, and disoriented before a single shot was fired. The pre-landing naval and air bombardment, which was supposed to obliterate the German defenses and crater the beach for cover, was a near-total failure. Due to the poor weather and fear of hitting their own landing craft, the bombers released their payloads too far inland, leaving the German fortifications on the bluffs virtually untouched. The naval bombardment was too short and inaccurate to have a significant effect. The German defenders were shaken, but they were very much alive and waiting. As the ramps of the first Higgins boats dropped, the full horror of Omaha Beach was unleashed. The German defenders, holding their fire until the ramps were down, opened up with a storm of machine gun, mortar, and artillery fire. The interlocking fields of fire from the machine gun nests on the bluffs created a deadly crossfire that swept the entire length of the beach. The American soldiers, packed shoulder to shoulder in the landing craft, were mown down in seconds. First-hand accounts from survivors paint a picture of unimaginable carnage. The water at the edge of the shore turned red with blood. Men were cut in half by machine gun fire as they tried to exit the boats. Others jumped over the sides only to be pulled under by the weight of their gear. The beach became a chaotic landscape of death, littered with the bodies of the dead and the cries of the wounded. The noise was deafening, a constant roar of explosions, machine guns, and screams. In the opening minutes of the assault, some companies suffered over 90% casualties. The meticulously crafted plan had disintegrated into chaos. The specialized amphibious tanks, the D.D. Shermans, which were supposed to provide crucial fire support, mostly foundered in the rough seas, with 27 of the first 32 launched sinking to the bottom of the English Channel. The combat engineers, tasked with clearing paths through the beach obstacles, were targeted relentlessly and suffered horrific losses, unable to complete their vital mission. The first wave was effectively annihilated. The survivors huddled behind the few pieces of cover available, the German obstacles, a small seawall known as the shingle, pinned down by the relentless fire. They were disorganized, leaderless, and terrified. For hours, it seemed that the landing in Omaha was on the verge of complete and total failure. General Omar Bradley, aboard the USS Augusta offshore, received reports so grim that he seriously contemplated evacuating the troops and diverting the follow-on waves to other beaches. But amidst the chaos and despair, leaders began to emerge. Officers and non-commissioned officers, seeing that the plan had failed, began to improvise. Men like Brigadier General Norman Cota and Colonel George Taylor rallied the terrified survivors, urging them off the beach. Taylor's famous exhortation, "Two kinds of people are staying on this beach, the dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here," captured the desperate reality. The only hope for survival was to move forward, to get off the beach and attack the bluffs. Small groups of soldiers from different units began to band together. Using the limited cover of ravines and gullies, they started the slow, agonizing process of climbing the bluffs. They used Bangalore torpedoes to blow gaps in the barbed wire and attack the German machine gun nests one by one with grenades and rifles. It was a brutal, inch-by-inch fight, but slowly, tentatively, they began to gain a foothold on the high ground. Crucially, as the tide receded, U.S. Navy destroyers, in a display of incredible bravery and initiative, sailed dangerously close to the shore. They risked running aground to provide direct, point-blank fire support, targeting the German bunkers that their ships' captains could see were causing the most trouble. This naval gunfire was a critical turning point, suppressing the German defenses and giving the infantry on the beach the breathing room they needed to organize and advance. By midday, small breakthroughs had been achieved. The trickle of men getting off the beach became a steady stream. The engineers were finally able to clear some paths through the obstacles, allowing tanks and other vehicles to land and move inland. The German defenders of the 352nd Division, having fought tenaciously all morning, were beginning to run low on ammunition and were being worn down by the sheer, relentless pressure of the American assault. By the end of the day, the Americans had secured a tenuous beachhead on Omaha, about 1.5 miles deep, but the cost had been shocking. Allied casualties on D-Day totaled around 10,000, but Omaha Beach accounted for a disproportionate number of them, with estimates of American casualties ranging from 2,000 to over 4,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. It was the bloodiest of all the landing beaches. The shock of D-Day was not that it happened, but the stark contrast between the brilliant success of the overall plan and the near-catastrophic failure and brutal reality of Omaha Beach. It was a visceral, horrifying reminder that even the best-laid plans can dissolve in an instant in the crucible of combat. It was a victory, and a monumental one at that, but it was a victory purchased with the blood of thousands of young men on a single terrible morning, a shocking price for a foothold on the continent of Europe. As 1944 drew to a close, the Allies on the Western Front were poised for the final push into Germany. The mood was one of weary optimism. The German army seemed to be a spent force, capable only of fighting a defensive, retreating battle. The shock of the Hurtgen Forest had been a sobering lesson, but the overall strategic picture looked bright. It was this atmosphere of confidence that set the stage for one of the most audacious and shocking gambles of the entire war, a massive, last-ditch German offensive that would catch the Allies completely by surprise and result in the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought by the United States Army. This was the Battle of the Bulge. In the winter of 1944, Adolf Hitler, despite the desperate situation facing Germany on all fronts, believed he could still achieve a decisive victory in the West. His plan was breathtaking in its ambition. He would muster the last of Germany's strategic reserves, including elite Panzer and SS divisions, for a surprise attack through the same rugged and densely forested Ardennes region that had been the gateway for the invasion of France in 1940. The objective was to smash through the thinly held American lines, cross the Meuse River, and then drive north to capture the vital port of Antwerp. Hitler believed this would split the Allied armies, cut their supply lines, and force the British and Americans to sue for a separate peace, allowing him to turn his full attention back to the Eastern Front. It was a plan born of desperation, a roll of the dice with the fate of the Reich at stake. To succeed, it relied on three critical elements: total surprise, rapid speed, and bad weather. The surprise was to be achieved by attacking in the Ardennes, a sector of the front considered quiet and used by the Allies as a rest and training area for new or battle-weary divisions. The speed was to be provided by the powerful spearheads of the panzer divisions. And the bad weather, the forecast of thick fog and low clouds, was essential to ground the overwhelmingly superior Allied air forces, which would otherwise decimate the German armored columns. The deception was masterful. The Germans maintained strict radio silence, moved troops only at night, and spread disinformation. The Allied High Command, suffering from a severe case of victory disease, dismissed the intelligence reports that did trickle in about a German buildup. They simply could not believe that the Wehrmacht was capable of mounting such a large-scale offensive. They were about to receive a very rude awakening. On the morning of December 16, 1944, under the cover of a massive artillery barrage, three German armies with over 200,000 soldiers and nearly 1,000 tanks and assault guns crashed into the startled American lines. The attack hit the U.S. First Army's 8th Corps, which was spread thinly over an 80-mile front. The initial impact was devastating. American units, caught completely off guard, were overwhelmed, bypassed, and in many cases simply disintegrated. The northern shoulder of the attack was met with fierce resistance by the U.S. 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions, who managed to slow the advance of the powerful 6th SS Panzer Army. But in the center, the German 5th Panzer Army smashed through the U.S. 28th and 106th Infantry Divisions. Two regiments of the 106th Division, a green unit new to combat, were quickly surrounded on the Schnee Eifel, a wooded ridge, and forced to surrender. Over 8,000 American soldiers were captured in what was the largest mass surrender of U.S. troops since the Civil War.
Der Avanz kreierte eine large Bulge in der amerikanischen Lines, geben dem Battle es nehmen. Panik und Konfusion spähte durch die alliierten Reha-Areals. Rumors rannen Wald. Ein spezielles Germane-Kommando-Unit lädt von dem Infamiben Otto Skorzeny mit englisch sprechenden Soldaten getrennt in amerikanischen Uniformen und using Capture Jeeps operierte behinder den Lines, spreading Disinformation, switching Road Signs und kreieren Chaos. Dies Psychological Warfare, weil haben einen limitierten taktischen Effekt, added to dem weit verbreiteten Sinn von Alarm.
A particularly shocking event occurred just one day into the offensive, which revealed the brutal nature of the forces Hitler had unleashed. Near the town of Malmedy, Belgium, a combat group from the 1st SS Panzer Division, led by the ruthless Joachim Paper, encountered and captured a battery of American soldiers. The approximately 120 American prisoners were herded into a field, and then, for reasons that are still debated, the SS troopers opened fire on them with machine guns and pistols. 84 American POWs were murdered in cold blood. The Malmedy massacre was not an isolated incident. It was one of a series of atrocities committed by Paper's unit, and it sent a wave of fury through the American ranks. From that point on, the battle became a no-quarter-given fight. In the face of the German onslaught, the Allied response was initially slow and confused, but General Eisenhower acted decisively. He rushed reinforcements to the area, including the elite 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. He also placed all American forces north of the Bulge under the command of British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, a move that would later cause considerable friction, but was necessary to restore command and control.
Der Plan dependete auf Speed, aber der waren Fallen behind schedule. Der stubborn Resistenz von small pockets of American soldiers at key road junctions and bridges slowed the panzer columns down, costing them precious time and fuel. The most famous of these stands took place at the crucial crossroads town of Bastogne.
The 101st Airborne Division, along with elements of other units, was rushed to the town and managed to set up a defense just before it was completely surrounded by German forces.
On December 22nd, the German commander sent a message to the American commander in Bastogne, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, demanding his surrender. McAuliffe's now legendary one-word reply was delivered back to the Germans. Nuts! The defiance of the battered bastards of Bastogne became a rallying cry for the Allies. Their heroic defense of the town denied the Germans a vital road network and acted as a major roadblock to their advance. Then, on December 23rd, the weather, which had been so crucial to the initial German success, finally broke. The fog and clouds lifted, and the cavalry of the air arrived. Thousands of Allied fighter bombers swarmed the skies over the Ardennes, wreaking havoc on the German armored columns and supply lines. They strafed and bombed tanks, trucks, and troop concentrations with impunity. The tide of the battle began to turn. On December 26th, elements of General George S. Patton's Third Army, which had executed a remarkable 90-degree turn and a forced march from the south, broke through the German lines and relieved the besieged defenders of Bastogne. With the weather clear and Allied reinforcements pouring in, the German offensive was doomed. The German spearheads had run out of fuel, ammunition, and momentum. The battle devolved into a grinding, bloody slog as the Allies slowly and systematically began to reduce the Bulge. By the end of January 1945, the lines had been restored to roughly where they were before the offensive began. But the cost was immense. The Battle of the Bulge was the costliest battle in American history. The U.S. Army suffered over 80,000 casualties, including approximately 19,000 killed. German losses were even higher, with estimates of over 100,000 casualties. More importantly, Germany had lost irreplaceable tanks, aircraft, and its last reserves of veteran troops. Hitler's final gamble had failed, and in doing so, it had hastened the final collapse of the Third Reich. The shock of the Battle of the Bulge was the sudden, terrifying realization that the war was far from over. It was a brutal wake-up call for an overconfident Allied command and a testament to the enduring, fanatical fighting power of the German army, even in the face of certain defeat. It was a winter of terror and heroism, of atrocities and defiance, a final, convulsive spasm of violence before the end in Europe. We now shift our focus from the forests of Europe to the urban heart of Asia, to a battle that stands as a shocking testament to the horrors of city fighting and the depths of human depravity in war. This was not a clash of armies in an open field, but a month-long struggle for a sprawling metropolis, a battle that would see one of the world's great cities systematically destroyed and its population subjected to an orgy of violence. This was the Battle of Manila, the bloody liberation of the Pearl of the Orient. In early 1945, General Douglas MacArthur's campaign to liberate the Philippines was in full swing. American forces had landed on the island of Luzon and were driving south towards the capital, Manila. MacArthur, who had a deep personal connection to the city, was determined to recapture it and was confident it could be done with minimal damage. He declared Manila an open city, hoping that the Japanese would withdraw without a fight to spare the civilian population and the city's historic architecture. It was a hope that would be cruelly, horrifically dashed.
日本のコマンダーのフィリピンズ、ジェネラル友幸山下、the same Tiger of Malaya, who had conquered Singapore, knew that defending Manila was a practical mistake. He ordered his troops to withdraw from the city into the mountains to fight a prolonged defensive campaign. However, one of his subordinates, Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi, commander of the Manila Naval Defense Force, defied these orders. Iwabuchi, a naval officer with a deep sense of shame over the loss of his battleship, was determined to fight to the death in Manila, taking as many Americans and Filipinos with him as possible. He commanded a force of around 16,000 sailors and marines, and they would turn the city into a fortress and a slaughterhouse.
The American advance into Manila began on February 3, 1945. The initial push was rapid, with American troops liberating thousands of Allied civilian internees at the Santo Tomas University camp in a daring raid. But as they pushed deeper into the city, the resistance stiffened dramatically. Iwabuchi's men were not interested in tactical defense. They were motivated by a fanatical desire to inflict maximum damage and die for the emperor. They had fortified every stone building, barricaded every street, and prepared for a brutal last-ditch stand. The battle for Manila quickly devolved into some of the most savage urban combat of the entire war. It was a house-to-house, room-to-room fight. The Japanese defenders were dug in and determined. They used the city's thick-walled government buildings, churches, and universities as formidable strongpoints. They had to be blasted out with direct-fire artillery, tank guns, and bazookas. Progress was slow, bloody, and incredibly destructive. American commanders, reluctant to use heavy aerial bombardment to avoid civilian casualties, found themselves in a terrible dilemma. The only way to dislodge the fanatical Japanese defenders was to systematically level the buildings they were hiding in. The fighting became a methodical process of destruction. A building would be pounded with artillery until it was a shattered ruin, and then the infantry would move in to mop up any remaining resistance. The city of Manila, with its beautiful Spanish colonial architecture, was being pulverized into dust and rubble. But the shocking horror of the Battle of Manila was not just the physical destruction of the city. It was the systematic, deliberate, and unspeakable violence that Admiral Iwabuchi's forces unleashed upon the civilian population. As the battle raged, the Japanese troops went on a rampage of murder, rape, and torture that is now known as the Manila Massacre. This was not random violence. Captured documents and survivor testimonies show it was an ordered and organized campaign of extermination. Filipino civilians were seen as collaborators with the Americans. They were herded into buildings, which were then set on fire or blown up with grenades. Men, women, and children were shot, bayoneted, and beheaded indiscriminately. Hospitals were not spared. Patients in their beds, doctors, and nurses were murdered. At St. Paul's College, Japanese soldiers massacred nearly 1,000 people. At the Red Cross building, they killed doctors and patients. Women and young girls were subjected to mass rape before being killed. The atrocities were on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. Civilians were used as human shields, forced to march in front of Japanese positions to deter American fire. Entire districts of the city were deliberately set ablaze by Japanese demolition squads, creating a raging inferno that consumed homes and businesses. The once vibrant city became a vision of hell, a landscape of burning ruins, rubble-choked streets, and the constant stench of death. The fighting was relentless. The battle for the Intramuros, the ancient walled city at the heart of Manila, was particularly fierce. The old stone walls and historic buildings provided perfect defensive positions for the Japanese. It took days of brutal, close-quarters fighting and heavy bombardment to finally clear the area, by which time it was a complete ruin. The final Japanese stand took place in the massive modern finance, agriculture, and legislative buildings, which had to be reduced to concrete skeletons before the last defenders were killed. By March 3, 1945, after a month of fighting, the Battle of Manila was over. The city was liberated, but it was a city that had been destroyed. The physical devastation was almost total. Only Warsaw, among all Allied capitals during the war, suffered greater destruction. But the human cost was the most shocking statistic of all. While approximately 1,000 American soldiers and 16,000 Japanese defenders were killed, the civilian death toll was staggering. It is estimated that at least 100,000 Filipino civilians were massacred by the Japanese or killed in the crossfire during that one horrific month. The Battle of Manila is a shocking and often overlooked chapter of the Pacific War. It stands as a horrifying example of what happens when fanatical ideology meets the brutal logic of urban warfare. The destruction of the Pearl of the Orient and the massacre of its people was not a strategic necessity. It was an act of nihilistic rage, a final, convulsive spasm of violence from a defeated and cornered foe. It is a grim reminder that the greatest victims of war are often the innocent civilians caught in the middle. From the man-made hell of a destroyed city, we journey to a natural fortress, an island that would become the stage for the bloodiest and most shocking battle of the entire Pacific War. This was a battle where the fighting was so intense, it was dubbed the Typhoon of Steel. It was a battle that would give American planners a terrifying preview of what an invasion of the Japanese mainland would entail. And it was a battle where the horror was not confined to the soldiers, but engulfed an entire civilian population in a wave of mass suicide and slaughter. This was the Battle of Okinawa. By the spring of 1945, the war in the Pacific was closing in on Japan. American forces, in their island-hopping campaign, had fought their way across the Central Pacific and had retaken the Philippines. The next logical step was the island of Okinawa, part of the Ryukyu island chain, just 340 miles south of mainland Japan. Capturing Okinawa would provide the Americans with vital air bases from which to launch the final invasion of Japan itself. The American command knew the battle would be tough, but they were not prepared for the sheer, fanatical ferocity of the Japanese defense.
Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima knew he could not prevent the Americans from landing. He also knew he could not defeat the overwhelmingly superior American force. His mission, therefore, was not to win, but to inflict the maximum number of casualties possible on the Americans. He planned to bleed them white, to make the cost of taking Okinawa so horrific that the United States would lose its will to invade the Japanese home islands. To achieve this, he devised a brilliant and brutal defensive strategy.
Instead of defending the beaches where his forces would be pulverized by American naval gunfire, Ushijima conceded the landings. He concentrated his 110,000-man 32nd Army in the southern third of the island, in a series of deep, interlocking defensive lines that took full advantage of Okinawa's rugged, hilly terrain. The core of his defense was a complex network of caves, tunnels, and fortified positions, particularly around the ancient Shuri Castle. This was to be a war of attrition, a bloody, grinding battle fought from concealed positions designed to kill as many Americans as possible for every yard of ground gained. The American invasion, codenamed Operation Iceberg, began on April 1, 1945. The initial landings were shockingly easy, so easy that the American soldiers were deeply suspicious. They swarmed ashore with almost no opposition. For the first week, they advanced rapidly, securing the northern two-thirds of the island. But when they reached Ushijima's main defensive line in the south, the battle for Okinawa began in earnest, and it was a nightmare beyond anything they had ever experienced. The fighting was a brutal, close-quarter struggle against a nearly invisible enemy. The Japanese would hold their fire until the Americans were almost on top of their positions, and then unleash a storm of machine gun, mortar, and artillery fire from perfectly concealed caves and pillboxes. Each hill, each ridge, each ravine had to be taken in a bloody frontal assault. The standard tactic became a grim routine. Pound a position with artillery and airstrikes, then send in the infantry with flamethrowers and satchel charges to clean out the caves one by one. It was slow, terrifying, and incredibly costly work. While the battle raged on land, a new and shocking form of warfare was being unleashed at sea. The Battle of Okinawa saw the first mass, organized use of kamikaze attacks. These divine wind suicide pilots, flying planes packed with explosives, would deliberately crash themselves into American ships. The psychological impact of these attacks was immense. There was no defense against a pilot who was determined to die. The sky was filled with Japanese planes diving through a storm of anti-aircraft fire. The U.S. Navy suffered its heaviest losses of the war, with 34 ships sunk and nearly 400 damaged. Over 5,000 American sailors were killed by kamikaze attacks alone. It was a shocking and terrifying tactic that demonstrated the fanatical desperation of the Japanese war effort. But the most shocking and tragic aspect of the Battle of Okinawa was the fate of the island's civilian population. Before the war, Okinawa was home to nearly 500,000 people. They were caught in the crossfire of the most intense battle of the Pacific War. But their suffering went far beyond being victims of combat. The Japanese military had indoctrinated the Okinawan civilians with horrific propaganda, telling them that the American soldiers were inhuman monsters who would rape, torture, and murder them. The Japanese soldiers told the civilians that it was better to die than to be captured. Fueled by this propaganda, and in many cases directly forced by the Japanese Imperial Army, Okinawan civilians began to commit mass suicide. Entire families would gather on cliffs and throw themselves to their deaths. Japanese soldiers distributed grenades to civilian groups, ordering them to kill themselves and their families. Those who were hesitant or refused were often killed by the Japanese soldiers themselves. The scenes of horror were indescribable, as mothers killed their own children before taking their own lives. As the American forces pushed south, they found caves filled with the bodies of civilians. The battle, which lasted for 82 bloody days, became a relentless grind. The weather turned, and heavy rains turned the battlefield into a sea of mud, making life even more miserable for the soldiers. The fighting for key positions like Sugarloaf Hill, Chocolate Drop Hill, and the Shuri Line was some of the most intense of the war. American casualties mounted at an alarming rate. Entire companies were wiped out. The psychological toll was immense, with rates of combat fatigue and psychiatric breakdown reaching epidemic levels. By late June, the Japanese defense was finally broken. General Ushijima and his chief of staff committed ritual suicide in their command post. The battle was over, but the island was a wasteland. The cost was beyond shocking. The Americans suffered over 49,000 casualties, including more than 12,500 killed. It was the costliest single battle for the U.S. forces in the entire war. The Japanese losses were even more catastrophic, with over 100,000 soldiers killed. Many of the remaining Japanese soldiers refused to surrender, hiding in caves or fighting to the death. But the most horrific statistic was the civilian toll. It is estimated that at least 100,000 Okinawan civilians, and perhaps as many as 150,000, a quarter to a third of the island's entire population, were killed, committed suicide, or went missing. The Typhoon of Steel had not just been a battle between armies, it had been the near annihilation of a people. The shock of Okinawa resonated all the way to the highest levels of the American government. The ferocity of the Japanese defense, the kamikaze attacks, and the mass civilian suicides provided a terrifying glimpse of what an invasion of the Japanese home islands would be like. The casualty projections for such an invasion were astronomical, running into the hundreds of thousands or even millions for both sides. The shocking bloodbath of Okinawa was a major factor in President Harry Truman's decision to use the atomic bomb in the hope of avoiding an even greater slaughter. It was a battle that, in its sheer, unmitigated horror, helped to usher in the nuclear age. We now turn to a battle that was not a battle in the conventional sense. There were no grand armored thrusts or amphibious landings. Instead, it was a slow, agonizing, and deliberate process of mass murder by starvation, a siege that lasted for nearly 900 days and stands as one of the most shocking examples of total war waged against a civilian population. This was a testament to both the depths of human cruelty and the incredible resilience of the human spirit. This was the Siege of Leningrad. In September 1941,
As part of Operation Barbarossa, German Army Group North, under the command of Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb, reached the outskirts of Leningrad, the second largest city in the Soviet Union and the symbolic cradle of the Bolshevik Revolution. Hitler, despising the city as the birthplace of Jewish Bolshevism, gave a direct and chilling order. Leningrad was not to be taken by storm. It was to be surrounded, cut off from all supply lines, and systematically starved and shelled into submission. The city and its entire population were to be, in his words, wiped from the face of the earth. On September 8, 1941, the German forces captured the town of Schlisselburg on the shores of Lake Ladoga, severing the last land connection to Leningrad. The city, home to nearly 3 million people, was now a besieged island, completely encircled by German forces to the south and their Finnish allies to the north. The siege had begun, and it would last for 872 agonizing days. Initially, the city's inhabitants and its leadership were unprepared for a long siege. Food rationing was introduced, but the initial rations were relatively generous, based on the assumption that the blockade would be broken quickly. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. As the weeks turned into months, the food supplies dwindled at an alarming rate. The rations were cut again and again and again until they reached starvation levels. By November 1941, the situation had become desperate. The daily bread ration for a manual worker was a mere 250 grams, and for office workers, children, and other dependents, it was a horrifying 125 grams. This bread was barely edible, a small, dense, damp slice made with sawdust, cottonseed cakes, and other fillers to extend the meager flour supply. This was often the only food a person would receive for an entire day. The city was slowly, deliberately being starved to death. The first winter of the siege, from 1941 to 1942, was one of the coldest on record. The city had no fuel for heating. Water pipes froze and burst. There was no electricity. People huddled in their frozen apartments, burning furniture, books, and floorboards to stay alive. And everywhere there was the gnawing, all-consuming hunger. People ate anything they could find. Wallpaper paste made from potatoes, boiled leather belts and briefcases, lipstick, and medical castor oil. They boiled animal hides to make a gelatinous broth. The city's pets, dogs, cats, and birds were all eaten. Then the rats disappeared. Death became a commonplace, everyday occurrence. People would collapse and die in the streets from starvation and exhaustion. They would die in their frozen apartments, their bodies often remaining for days or weeks until neighbors or special sanitation squads discovered them. Sleds became a prominent sight on the streets of Leningrad, not for children to play on, but for the living to drag the bodies of their dead family members to overflowing morgues or mass graves. The city was turning into a giant tomb. The most shocking and horrifying consequence of the extreme starvation was the breakdown of the ultimate human taboo, cannibalism. The historical record, including secret police reports and personal diaries, is filled with accounts of this horror. There were two types: corpse eating, where desperate people would secretly cut flesh from the recently deceased, and the even more terrifying predatory cannibalism, where individuals or gangs would murder people to eat them. The city police even created a special division to combat this phenomenon. Diaries from the siege document the terror of parents who feared their children would be stolen and eaten, the whispered rumors of meat patties being sold in the markets with a suspicious origin. It was the ultimate degradation, the final horror of a city pushed beyond the limits of human endurance.
Yet, amidst this unimaginable suffering, the city of Leningrad refused to die. The spirit of its people was, in its own way, as shocking as the brutality of the siege. The factories, though running on minimal power, continued to produce tanks and weapons for the city's defense.
Theaters and orchestras continued to perform, a defiant gesture of culture and humanity in the face of barbarism. The most famous of these events was the performance of Dmitri Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, the Leningrad Symphony, in the besieged city in the summer of 1942. The musicians were starving, some so weak they had to be carried onto the stage. But they played with a passion and fury that was broadcast to the German lines as a message of unbreakable will. A lifeline, however tenuous, did exist. During the winter, when the vast Lake Ladoga froze over, a supply route known as the Road of Life was established across the ice. Trucks, under constant German artillery fire and air attack, braved the treacherous ice to bring in vital food supplies and evacuate the weak and starving. The Road of Life was incredibly dangerous. Thousands of trucks and people broke through the ice and were lost to the frozen water. But it was enough to keep the city from total annihilation. It did not end the starvation, but it allowed Leningrad to survive.
The siege continued for another year and a half. The city was under constant, daily bombardment from German artillery, which killed and maimed thousands more. But the worst of the starvation had passed after the first winter. The Red Army launched several offensives to try and break the siege, all of which were costly and unsuccessful, until finally, in January 1944, a massive Soviet offensive, Operation Iskra, smashed through the German lines and opened a permanent land corridor to the city. On January 27, 1944, the siege of Leningrad was officially lifted.
The cost was beyond comprehension. While exact figures are impossible to determine, it is estimated that at least 1 million civilians died in Leningrad during the siege, the vast majority from starvation. Including military casualties, the total death toll may be as high as 1.5 to 2 million people. It was a demographic catastrophe on a scale that dwarfs many other famous battles of the war combined.
The siege of Leningrad is shocking not for a single violent climax, but for its prolonged, systematic, and calculated cruelty. It was a war of attrition waged not against an army, but against men, women, and children. It stands as one of history's most horrific war crimes, a testament to the Nazi regime's ideological commitment to extermination. And yet, it is also one of history's most profound stories of survival, a shocking testament to the will of a city that endured 872 days of hell and refused to be broken. We have arrived at the battle that, for many, defines the shocking nature of the Second World War more than any other. This was a confrontation of such monumental scale, such apocalyptic brutality, and such profound strategic significance that it is universally regarded as the single most important turning point of the war. It was a battle that consumed a city, 2 armies, and nearly 2 million lives. It was a maelstrom of fire, steel, and ice that would not only decide the fate of the Eastern Front, but the fate of the world. This is the Battle of Stalingrad. In the summer of 1942, after the failure to capture Moscow, Hitler launched a new major offensive on the Eastern Front, codenamed Case Blue. The objective was to drive south, capture the rich oil fields of the Caucasus, and cut the Soviet Union's vital supply lines on the Volga River. The key to this plan was the city of Stalingrad. Named after the Soviet leader, the city was a major industrial center stretching for miles along the western bank of the Volga. For Hitler, capturing the city that bore his enemy's name became a personal obsession, a matter of prestige that would transcend all strategic logic.
Der 6. Armee unter dem Kommando von General Friedrich Paulus war eine der feinsten Formationen in der Wehrmacht. Es hatte einen Brauthistorie von Iktoria und war auf dem Peak auf seiner Kraft. In Late August 1942 ist Spearheads räten die Ausreise von Stalingrad. Der Battle begann mit einem massiven und terrorierenden Airbombardement durch die Luftflotte 4 für 2 Tage. Die Stadt wurde pounded rehlos. Über 1000 Tonnen Bomben wurden geworfen, kreieren ein massives Feuersturm, der in ganz die Stadt,
killten einen estimierten 40.000 Zivilisten und reduzierte most of Stalingrad auf ein smolderndes Landschaft von Rubble, twistetem Stahl und charred Ruinen.
The Germans believed the city was finished, that the main battle was over. They were wrong. The battle had just begun. The destruction, paradoxically, turned the city into a defender's paradise. The mountains of rubble, the skeletal remains of factories, and the labyrinth of shattered buildings provided perfect cover for the Soviet defenders. The battle for Stalingrad would not be a conventional war of maneuver. It would be what the Germans came to call Rattenkrieg, rat war. It was a savage, close-quarters fight in the ruins, in the sewers, in basements, and on rooftops. The Soviet 62nd Army, under the command of the tough and unyielding General Vasily Chukov, was tasked with defending the city. Chukov's orders were simple and brutal, not one step back. He understood that to fight the Germans' superior tactics and air power, he had to hug the enemy, to keep his front line as close to the Germans as possible, often just the width of a street or even a single wall. This negated the Germans' ability to use artillery and airstrikes for fear of hitting their own men. The fighting became a series of small, vicious struggles for every building, every floor, every room. Life expectancy for a new soldier arriving in the city was often less than 24 hours. The fighting was continuous, day and night. Snipers from both sides stalked the ruins, turning the simple act of crossing a street into a life-or-death gamble. Famous duels, like that of the Soviet hero Vasily Zaitsev, became legendary. The battle raged for control of key symbolic locations: the massive Red October steel factory, the Barakati arms factory, and the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory. But the most famous was the fight for a single apartment building, which a small platoon of Soviet soldiers under the command of Sergeant Yakov Pavlov held for 2 months against constant German assaults. Pavlov's house became a symbol of the city's unbreakable resistance. The Germans, with their superiority in tanks and aircraft, slowly, bloodily pushed the Soviets back towards the Volga. By November, they controlled over 90% of the city. The Soviet defenders were clinging to a few narrow strips of land on the riverbank, often only a few hundred yards deep. They were supplied at night by boats crossing the Volga under constant German bombardment. The situation seemed hopeless. The Germans were on the verge of a final, decisive victory. But just as at Moscow, the Soviet High Command, led by Stalin, Zhukov, and Vasilevsky, had been planning a massive counterstroke. While the Sixth Army was being bled white in the meat grinder of the city, the Soviets had been secretly building up immense forces on the flanks of the German advance, in the sectors held by the weaker Romanian and Italian armies. The plan, codenamed Operation Uranus, was a classic deep encirclement, a massive pincer movement designed to trap not just the Sixth Army, but the entire German force in and around Stalingrad. On November 19, 1942, in the midst of a blinding snowstorm, the Soviet offensive was launched. Huge masses of Soviet infantry and tanks smashed through the Romanian lines north and south of the city. The Romanian armies, ill-equipped and demoralized, collapsed almost immediately. The Soviet armored corps raced across the frozen open steppe, their objective not to fight the Germans, but to bypass them and meet at the town of Kalach, deep in the German rear. The shock to the German command was absolute. They had been so fixated on the city itself that they had completely ignored the threat to their flanks. On November 23rd, just 4 days after the offensive began, the two Soviet pincers met at Kalach. The trap was sprung. The entire German Sixth Army, along with parts of the 4th Panzer Army, a force of over 250,000 men, was completely surrounded. Initially, there was a chance for the Sixth Army to break out. But Hitler, urged on by the boastful promises of Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Göring that he could supply the trapped army by air, forbade it. He ordered Paulus to stand fast, to turn Stalingrad into Fortress Stalingrad, and await a relief effort. It was a fatal decision. The promised airlift was a catastrophic failure. The Luftwaffe lacked the planes and the capacity to deliver the massive amount of supplies needed, and a Red Air Force inflicted heavy losses on the transport planes that did make it through.
Inside the Kessel, or cauldron, the situation for the Sixth Army deteriorated into a vision of hell. The brutal Russian winter set in. The soldiers, still in summer uniforms, began to starve. Rations were cut to near zero. They ran out of ammunition. Frostbite, typhus, and dysentery ravaged the ranks. The horses were eaten, then the dogs. The proud, victorious army was reduced to a huddled, freezing, starving mob, trapped in a frozen wasteland under constant Soviet attack.
Ein Relief-Attempt, Operation Winterstorm, war gelauncht im Dezember, aber es wurde stoppt von den Sowjets Meilen von dem Pocket. Das letzte Glimmer von Hope war extinct. Bei Januar der Sowjets begannen die finale Offensive, um die Pocket zu liquidieren, splittern es in smaller und smaller pieces. Der End war ein grimm, agonisierende Affäre.
On January 31, 1943, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, whom Hitler had promoted in a last-ditch effort to encourage him to commit suicide rather than be captured, surrendered the southern pocket. 2 days later, on February 2nd, the last remnants of the northern pocket laid down their arms. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. Of the nearly 300,000 Axis soldiers trapped in the pocket, over 150,000 had died from combat, starvation, or disease. Of the 91,000 who surrendered, only 5,000 would ever see Germany again.
The shock of Stalingrad was total and irreversible. It was not just a military defeat. It was a catastrophe of a magnitude that the German people and the Wehrmacht had never imagined possible. An entire army, the best in the Reich, had been utterly annihilated. The myth of Hitler's military genius was shattered. For the Soviet Union, it was a victory of almost religious significance, purchased at the cost of over 1 million of their own casualties in the battle. It was the moment the tide of the war turned for good. From Stalingrad, the road for the Red Army led only one way, west towards Berlin. We have journeyed through the crucible of the Second World War, witnessing 10 moments of profound shock and horror. From the fall of an empire in Singapore to the grinding attrition of the Hurtgen Forest. From the titanic clash of steel at Kursk to the desperate defense of Moscow. From the bloody sands of Omaha Beach to the last-ditch gamble in the Ardennes. From the slaughter of civilians in Manila and Okinawa to the slow, agonizing starvation of Leningrad. And finally, to the apocalyptic turning point at Stalingrad. Each of these battles tells a story of human experience pushed to its absolute limit.
What makes these battles so shocking? It is the shattering of expectations. The expectation that a fortress was impregnable, that an army was invincible, that a plan was foolproof, or that a conflict had certain moral boundaries. These battles tore through those expectations, revealing the chaotic, unpredictable, and often inconceivably brutal nature of total war. They show us that victory and defeat are often decided not just by strategy and steel, but by weather, by terrain, by logistics, and by the sheer, indomitable, or fanatical will of the human spirit. The statistics associated with these conflicts are staggering. The numbers so large they risk becoming abstract. Millions of lives lost, cities turned to rubble, entire generations scarred. But behind every number is a human story. A soldier's terror in a foxhole, a civilian's grief in a bombed-out apartment, a commander's agonizing decision. The shock of these battles lies in their power to force us to confront the reality of these individual stories, multiplied by the millions. They serve as a powerful and sobering reminder of the true cost of war. They are not just chapters in a history book. They are enduring warnings. They show the dangers of hubris and overconfidence, the horrifying consequences of ideology fueled by hatred, and the incredible capacity of human beings for both unimaginable cruelty and breathtaking resilience. The echoes of these shocking battles still reverberate today, shaping our world, our politics, and our understanding of the fragility of peace. To study them is not to glorify conflict, but to understand its profound and lasting impact. It is to honor the memory of those who endured these hellscapes and to recognize that the peace and stability many of us enjoy today were forged in these very fires. The legacy of these 10 shocking battles is a testament to the darkest and, paradoxically, some of the most courageous moments of our shared human history. It is a legacy that we must never, ever forget.